Ready to up your game against weeds? Today, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the 9 tools you have in your toolbox as a grower to get rid of those weeds. Every weed has a weakness, and these tools will help you find and kill every type of weed under the sun, but organically. Let's get growing. Hello, and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you. Don't let the world hold you back. Pray Just Plant. Welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in Season 6, Episode 11, we're going to be talking about the 9 tools you as growers can use to control your weeds organically. I want to help you find the tools so that you can win that war against the weeds this year. The weeds are a bane to all gardeners. And every gardener asks, how will my war on weeds go this year? Will I win or will the weeds win? What if I told you that the winner of the war will be the one with the best tools? Yes, weeds have tools too. You have tools and weeds have tools. Their tools are how they grow, how they spread. Do they spread by seeds? Do they spread by their roots? Or does the root if it gets cut up into little pieces, do they spread that way? Knowing these weaknesses of the plant or what they think are the advantages are going to help you connect the tools you have in your garden tool shed to eradicate these weeds. And we're going to do it organically. All the tools that I mentioned here are going to be organically. And what I mean by that is they're not going to harshly damage either the soil, because remember, we are stewards of the soil first. Some of the weed things that we try as growers damage the microorganisms as well. And they're not going to be any chemicals. They're not going to be any harsh chemicals that are going to harm the fruits and vegetables around them or harm the grower, the gardener, the person in the garden actually growing these fruits and vegetables. A lot of pesticides and things are not only there to get rid of the weed, but we have to wear masks to use them. We have to not go into the garden for several days so that they don't hurt us. So all of these things are going to be organic. They're not going to be harmful in any way. So weeds have tools and we have tools too. Weeds have tools with how they spread and how they grow. So our number one tool that we can use to utilize weeds is by identifying them. So let's first identify what is a weed. According to Weed Science Society of America, there are 3 different weed definitions. A weed is a plant that causes economic loss or ecological damages, creates health problems for humans or animals, or is undesirable where it grows. A weed can be simply a plant that you don't like. In my pastures, it could be a plant that is harmful to my animals, something that is poisonous to them. Another definition of a weed is a noxious weed. A noxious weed is any plant designated by the federal, state, or local government officials as injurious to public health, agriculture, recreation, wildlife, or property. Once a weed is classified as a noxious, authorities can implement quarantines and take other actions to contain or destroy the weeds and limit its spread. So noxious weeds are something that we do as growers need to take seriously. We can't just let them grow because one, if they spread onto our neighbor's property, we're going to feel really bad about that. And number 2, there's probably a reason why these weeds need to be controlled. The next type of weed or definition of a weed is invasive weeds. Invasive weeds establish and persist and spread wildly in natural ecosystems outside their plant's native range. When in a foreign environment, these invaders often lack natural enemies to curtail their growth, which allows them to overrun native plants and ecosystems. One plant that we have here on the homestead that is an invasive weed is cheatgrass or cheatgrass. There's different names for it. That's why you need to identify your weeds. That's your number one tool. But it is actually it was brought over in the ships when immigrants brought over China. And China, not the country, but China, the actual plates and saucers and beautiful stoneware from China. They actually packed cheatgrass around these plates, and it was brought across on boats and then spread across the United States when people ordered these plates. And it has been an invasive weed since that time because there's really nothing in our environment. It's a grass that can control it. The problem with it, though, is because of what it can do to animals. So some growers call it cheek grass because actually once the seed head goes to maturity, it has this little barb on the end. And when animals eat it, it can get stuck in their cheek and be harmful. Another thing is cheat grass is the other word for it because it can cheat your animals. It doesn't have very high nutrient value. In fact, it grows really well in low fertile soil. So this can be a sign that your pastures are going to need more fertilization or more organic matter. And there is a couple places that this happens on our property just because we live on a hill. It's hard to keep a lot of the organic matter and nutrients at the top of the hill. So the cheat grass takes advantage of that. Now that's a definition of a weed, but there's also different types of weeds. We have annual weeds, and then there's the perennial weeds. And a perennial weed is a weed that is difficult to control. Most of these need to be dug up by the roots and have underground tubers or rhizomes, which do not overkill through the winter. New weeds can grow from any piece that is broken off of the remaining tuber in the soil. There are several of these in a list that I have. I wrote a blog post about the 9 most common weeds we all fight and their weaknesses. Our number one tool when we go to fight weeds is by identifying them. When we identify them, we can connect them to their weaknesses. So I have this blog post pulled up here in front of me, and we're going to look at the first weed, and it's bindweed. And bindweed is something that I fight in my garden, and I will continue to probably fight it for years because bindweed is a hardy perennial that has a few different common names like wild morning glories or creeping jennies or sheepbine or cornbine and bellbine. It's all over the world. These weeds spread by rootstock and by seed. So by knowing how they spread, you can connect that what the weed thinks is their most advantage, the way they spread, the way they grow, the way they multiply. Our tools need to match that, but not allow it to happen. So the weed's greatest, which they think is the greatest advantage, is actually for us, we have to see that as a weakness. We can see that as a weakness that we can get in there and we can stop the spread of this weed before it can grow and grow and grow. Now, one of the big bad things about bindweed is that it spreads by their roots, and it spreads by breaking up of their roots. So for years and years, I used the tool tilling because that's how I did my garden before I switched over to no-till. I thought I was doing a good thing. I was getting rid of the weeds. They were getting chopped up. I threw them into the compost pile, into the chickens. But what I was actually doing by using the wrong tool, I was encouraging these weeds to grow. I was breaking up those roots into tiny little pieces, and that's all bindweed needs to survive. So I was feeding it its advantage and feeding its tactic to grow and spread. And what I needed to be doing is changing that advantage to a weakness in my garden. I needed to be figuring out a way to get rid of it. But here, before we start talking about the tools, yes, we're talking about tool number 1 with weed identification. But what I want you to see is that we are going to talk about the tools and we're going to be tying them into weeds in how they spread, their advantage. So we're going to be talking about a tool, and then I'm going to tell you what weeds this tool will be good against. Now, I'm not going to give you a specific name of a weed, but I'm going to aim at how they spread, because if we look at how they spread, we're looking at what the weed thinks is an advantage, and we're changing it to a weakness. And we're going to attack the way they spread so we can start controlling them, because we first see how they make and grow and do their thing to create more, if we can stop them from creating more, we can eventually get it down to only a few, and then we can start eradicating those few, and then we're going to deplete that weed from our pastures, from our yards, from our gardens. And a weed technically is a plant that you don't want growing there. Me personally, I love dandelions in my yard. I'm not going to be attacking the dandelions. They are the first food for the bees on our property. We don't have a hive of bees. We are, for this first year, we're going to be, a friend of ours runs a few bees, and she's going to be bringing one of her hives to hang out at our house this summer just so that it gets the proper food that it needs. And I'm so excited, and I can't wait for that to happen. I guess what I'm trying to say is that to me, dandelions are not a weed. So that's something that I won't be fighting. But something else in my garden that is a weed is bindweed, or something else that is a weed for me in my pastures is these, it's called sticky bush. The reason I don't like it, one, the goats won't eat it, but it also sticks to their fur and it has this syrup and things on it. And it's just very aggravating when we're trying to take care of our animals and take care of our property. Now, speaking about other blog posts, I have another blog post called The 12 Ways to Stop Weeds Frustrations Organically. And these are ways, not tools. So that's kind of what I want to define really quick for you. So a way that you can control weeds is by topping. And we're going to talk about topping in one of the tools that we're going to use. So be sure to check out that episode too. And I did a podcast episode on that as well. It was 12 ways to stop your weeds. We said that tool number 1 is weed identification. So there's 2 ways that you can do that. You can check out that blog post I talked about with weed identification, where I talked about those 9 different common weeds. But you could also try out a really cool app. We're all about apps right nowadays, and gardeners have apps too. It's called Planet Net, and I will share the link to this app in the description and in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. You can use this simple app. All you do is take a picture of plant that you're trying to eradicate, or the plant that you're trying to identify. Maybe some of the plants that you identify, you find that you like them and find that a good use for them. I found that when I was doing that blog post about the common weeds, I found one of my common weeds I have in my garden is called marshmallow plant, and I can use that in my kitchen if I choose to. So that was kind of cool. So identifying your plants is really going to be very beneficial. So using this app, you just take a picture of it, and the app will load up that picture, and then you choose your country, and then the app identifies the weed from the whole planet. And it's really cool. We've had a few trees, it does trees as well, that we were planted here on the property before we moved. So we wanted to identify them. And this app did that for us. It was really amazing. So you just use your camera to point and shoot, and it takes you to a gallery, and it narrows down to about 4 or 5 different plants, because plant identification is a very hard task. It is something that needs a little bit of time and finesse with. So it helps you get at least to the top 5, and then you can be looking at them and you can identify them a little bit closer. Another great option of this app is it shares different pictures that other people have taken and have found the identification for. So you can look at those pictures, because plants grow differently, and sometimes you may be taking a picture of this weed when it's just barely germinating and the app hasn't figured it out yet, but maybe someone else took that same picture and they figured out what it was because they took a few more pictures when it grew bigger and grew more mature and connected it. So I think that's a great addition to this app, because it also brings in other people who are also looking for this plant just like you. It's also going to give you information about this plant. It's going to talk about its habits and how it grows and how it spreads. And that's our number 1 tool that we can use to eradicate weeds, or whatever we classify as a weed, a plant on our property, because we learn about it. And then we can use other tools to take action to get rid of it. So, like I said before, the weakness of your weeds is what they think as is their advantage. Our main goal as growers is just to stop weeds from spreading, because once we can stop them from spreading, they'll slowly stop growing more and more of them, and then we can eradicate them from our property. But now it is time for the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share with you a few bonus tips and tricks I use here at Red Ridge Farm Homestead. This week's tip is brought to you by the Building Soil Health Handbook. This handbook was designed to help you take the guessing out of improving your soil, to help you become the expert your soil has been waiting for you to be. Many of us think that we're gardeners of vegetables and gardeners of fruits, but we're not. We are stewards of the soil. In this handbook, I walk you through the 4 steps I've used here at the farm to improve my soil. I want to help you become the expert that you never realized you could be. To grab your free copy, go to redridgefarm.org/resources. This week's tip is all about using a rain gauge on your homestead. A rain gauge is a device. It could be a cup that you put out there and measure how much rain. It could be a special one that you buy from your local growing store. It could be a bucket that you keep track of how quickly it fills. A rain gauge can be anything, but the purpose of a rain gauge is to help measure how much rain actually occurs on your homestead. You can use it when you're trying to measure for rain barrels, how many rain barrels you're going to need, what's the capacity of your roof in so much rain, the max capacity or the minimum capacity. You can use it to keep track of, say, in your garden vegetables usually need about an inch of rain or an inch of precipitation or an inch of water every week. So if you keep track with a rain gauge how much is watered already that week with rain, then you only need to make up the difference. And this can help with not overwatering or not underwatering. So rain gauge is very important on the homestead. It's something that I keep in my field log when a big rainstorm happens or even a light drizzle. I try to keep track of how much rain it actually has accumulated. And I know for the past few years, we've been going through a really hard drought here in Wyoming. So keeping track of my rain is really important, because then I can see how severe the drought is. You can look back at different records that you've had over the years and really see what type of rainfall you are getting, what kind of water situations you are dealing with on your homestead. Because another aspect of rain is funneling it to other areas. I talked about in my homestead design guide series that we've been having here on the blog and here on the podcast, we've been talking about utilizing your extras. Well, rain can be that extra. And the simple way to keep track of rain is in a rain barrels or keep hold of it. But another way is to design your land, design different features in your land. Like say you want to build a pond, say you want to funnel runoff down to a certain area. We have started to funnel runoff towards our food forest so that we don't have to water our food forest as often. The food forest also acts as a way to slow the water down so it's just not rushing off our hill. By having a rain gauge, I'm going to be able to know how much accumulation when I go to build a pond, or I know when I go to funnel water. I know how much is accumulating. I know how big of a storm my infrastructure can handle this big of a storm and the things I need to do for it. So rain gauge is very important on the homestead. So adding one is very easy, and there's so many things you can learn from by keeping track of the rainfall on your property. So we are talking about the tools we gardeners have to combat the tools that weeds have to get rid of them in our gardens or on our homestead or in our pastures or anywhere. And we've talked about identifying your weeds. That is your number one tool that you have against weeds. So tool number 2 is a simple garden hoe. Now this is going to help you get rid of weeds that spread by seed or spread by roots. Now they're spreading by roots and then they're spreading by roots cuttings. And when we talked about bindweed, that was root cuttings. So here we're talking about spreading by seed or spreading by roots. One example, it would be quick grass. Quick grass grows by roots. So you may pull the little grass out, but if you leave that root in the soil, it's going to regrow and it's going to spread. Another one that spreads by seed is thistle. Canadian thistle spreads by seed. It has a very large seed that has millions of seeds in it. If you can top it before it actually make seeds, you're going to be getting ahead of the growing curve of that plant. So let's talk about that number 2 tool, garden hoe. There's many different types of hoes, but all can be divided into about 2 types. There's the drawn or the scuffle. A drawn hoe is kind of like your common hoe. It is a blade is set at 90-degree angle from the shaft, and it is used by chopping into the ground, and then the blade is pulled or drawn toward you. That's why it's called a drawn hoe. I think it's the most common one. The only thing that I see as a setback from this hoe, I personally don't use it. I know when I was a new gardener and you go to the growing store and it's like, oh, a hoe. Those are usually the common ones. They are very hard to use. They're very ineffective. They take a lot of strength. They're just one that I avoid. Now, my favorite hoe, the stirrup hoe, is the second type, which is a scuffle hoe. And this scuffle hoe is used to scrape the soil and loosen the top 2 inches and cut the weeds off at the roots. The 2 designs are the Dutch or flat blade, or the hoop, which I call a stirrup hoe because it looks like a stirrup on a saddle. It's going to be really hard for me to explain it, and I'm going to try to explain it to my best of my knowledge, but I really suggest that you go and look at the show notes if you want to see a picture of these different hoes. So if you picture a square, because there's actually a top to it, and it has a handle on the top of the square, the bottom of the U is sharpened on each side, that's a stirrup hoe. It doesn't take as much energy because what you're doing is you're just getting down into the soil. You can go a couple inches, and it's great for weeds that spread by seed or root, because we're getting that plant pulled out of the ground before it can go to seed, and roots, this type of hoe gets down into the ground and pulls those roots out of the soil. Now, is that a good tool for bindweed that spreads by root cuttings? No, but we're going to get to a tool that will help you there. So tool number 3 is a string trimmer. Now there's lots of different words or names for this. We can call it a weed eater, a weed whacker. Usually string trimmer only has the flexible filament line instead of a blade, but some of people are taking simple weed whackers or weed eaters and improving that, getting rid of the string and putting in a blade that still can be used in this category. But in short, it is used to cut down weeds. And this is going to help. This is that tool that we can use for topping. Remember, I talked about that there is 12 ways to stop weeds, and one of the ways is to do topping. And this is a tool that we can use to top weeds. And a weed whacker, a string trimmer, whatever you call it, this tool is best used to cut down large amounts of weeds before they seeds ripen and drop. And so its best advantage against other weeds is to cut them down before they spread by seeds. Pretty much any weed that spreads by seed, this tool will help with. So it is a tool that can help with a lot of things. This tool can even help with cover crops, putting in those, or cutting down extra grasses, or trimming an edge along a garden. There's lots of uses for a string trimmer or a weed whacker. We call it a weed eater here at the homestead, but it's a great tool. So let's get into tool number 4. Landscape fabric is a textile material that is used to control weeds by inhibiting their exposure to sunlight. It is hard to use this tool in ground vegetable gardens, but it works great in the newly established flower beds or paths in a raised gardens. One thing to remember is that this is usually made of woven polypropylene and is not biodegradable. Now, newspapers can be also used in this same fashion, but they are biodegradable. This is a better option for veggie gardens because it can be cleaned up in the fall and added to the compost pile. Both of these are usually covered by some kind of mulch, which we're going to get to talking about a little bit more when tool 8. So this type of tool is best used in flower beds. But if you have flower beds that spread by seed, you're going to want to use newspaper, because then you are still allowing that flower that you want to spread be able to spread, but it's going to limit the amount of spread. And the newspaper will also suppress the weeds for about a year before it breaks down. So you're going to have to keep replacing that newspaper. What you're doing is you're covering the soil, you're blocking out the soil with either weed cloth or newspaper just to create a barrier. What this tool does is it helps combat seeds or weeds that spread by root, spread by seed, and spread by severed root. This is a great way to combat that bindweed that we've been talking about, and seeds as well. Now, if you're, like I said before, you're establishing flower beds that spread by seed, you're going to have to take that into account, and maybe you don't want them to spread as voraciously as they could. So using newspaper or a weed blocker is going to help with those situations. Tool number 5 is your gardening knife, or a hori-hori knife. It's a specific type of knife. The garden knife is a multi-purpose knife that can be used in any type of gardening task: digging, weeding, pruning, transplanting, harvesting, and so much more. This type of knife is great for cutting a weed that has a strong taproot deep below the soil when hand weeding is necessary. So things like that I can think of that has a strong taproot, I'm going to jump over to that 9 Commons blog post and be looking at that. But something that has a strong taproot for sure would be your thistles, Canadian thistle, and dandelions have a strong taproot. So if a dandelion's growing where you don't want it to grow, that could be a use there. There's also the mallow plant, which I talked to you about, was that marshmallow kind of plant, but it actually is called the mallow plant. And those have big taproots. So those are a few weeds that you could be using the garden knife for. Hand weeding is always best done after watering, but not right after watering, just so that the soil is easy to cut in through to get to that taproot. So the weeds that we're going after with this type of tool are going to be weeds that spread by seed and spread by root. Most things are going to be spreading by seed because everything makes seed. But these taproot type plants are going to spread by root, and that's where this hori-hori knife or gardening knife is going to help you out. Tool number 6 is your garden gloves. You can rip a weed out so much more proficiently when you have something to protect your hands from the soil, water, and the cold. Gardening gloves are usually made from a lightweight cotton, leather, or waterproof materials such as rubber. I really don't like those type because my hands kind of sweat in them, but if you like that, that is perfectly fine. They essentially are used to protect your hands while hand weeding. I know hand weeding is not my favorite either, but this is a great time to enjoy the quiet. I know one of the greatest tools, I think also, this is going to be a bonus tool, is that you need to weed early. You need to be weeding those weeds when they're just little tiny babies. And yes, weeding gets out of hand. And yes, we have to take control of it when it does. All these tools are going to be easier to use when those weeds are little. And as for garden gloves, I love them when I'm weeding around my roses because that really helps. I do use newspaper and things around the roses and mulch, which we're going to get into talking about. But the garden gloves are there to protect you because you are always part of the solution too. You are a tool and you need to be protected as well. So those are the next tools. And now we're going to take a short break and we're going to get into the Growing with God segment of this episode where you and I dive into the Bible and build that relationship with our Lord and Savior. We are continuing in our series about gaining that confidence that the Lord has given us in this time of separation, this time of trial, this time of stress, this time of uncertainty. And I just wanted to pause through our Bible study of Ephesians just to remind you that God is there for you through these times as well. We're going to be reading Hebrews chapter 4, 14 through 16. I do want to tell you right here, when I read this in a Bible study that I did on Hebrews, it really opened up my eyes to how Jesus is currently helping us, how we can have the confidence in Jesus right now. Even though he hasn't come back, he's still there. He's still working for us. Therefore, since we have a great priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Jesus came to earth and he was born a child, a human child, and lived into his 30s here on earth. He knows what it's like. He knows the struggles that we face every single day. He knows what it's like to live in a time of tyranny. I mean, the Roman Empire was beginning to persecute Christians. This was a time also of turmoil. He knows what you and I are going through. And not only does he know, but he is our high priest. He is the one sitting next to God, and he is as this says right here, he is the one who talks for us. He is the one who empathizes with us because he understands. Sometimes it's hard to visualize God as someone who's easy to talk to, someone who we're supposed to respect and fear the Lord. And that is very true. But sometimes he can seem unattainable. He can seem out of reach. But he had this plan from the very beginning. I've told you before in Genesis 3:3, he says to the serpent, this woman will bear in her future, many generations ahead, she will bear a son that will crush your head and you will bite his heel. God had a plan of Jesus coming, and he also had the plan of Jesus taking away our sins. But on top of that, Jesus now understands our plight. He understands our day-to-day. He understands you and me. And not only does he understand us, he's our mediator. He's the one who talks to God when we approach the throne, when we go to him. He will be the one who will be the mediator between that, and he will be understanding. He already knows what it's like to be us. So you and I can have the confidence, the understanding that Jesus knows what it's like to be you. He knows what it's like to be and live here on earth, and that we are not going to be approaching a throne that we may feel unworthy at. We are not going to be approaching a throne that we will be looked down upon. So I just want you to have confidence this week and think about this week that you are a part of God's church, and that as that part, your high priest is Jesus Christ, and he understands you completely. On to more tools that we can use in our war against weeds. We've talked about the first 6. Yes, these are tools. There are other ways that you can eradicate weeds, but today we're talking about the tools. We've talked about the number 1, identification. That is our number 1 tool as growers, is our knowledge of what these weeds are. Tool number 7, this is going to be a little bit out of the box, and you probably have never thought of this before. But tool number 7 is our mindset. I do some of my best thinking when I'm pulling weeds. Martha Smith. Hand weeding can be a bane of your existence, or it can be the time spent alone with your thoughts. This all has to do with mindset. I often use time in the garden to pray, listen to the Lord, and the Lord is with us whatever and wherever we are. So weeds can be a struggle, and we can think of so many different tools that we can use to get rid of weeds. But sometimes the biggest struggle is our defiance against them. I wouldn't say hate, but our discouragement when they occur in our garden, or our annoyance, that's the word, annoyance when we find them. Now, we can be annoyed and we can be frustrated and we can attack these weeds with vengeance. If that's something you need, if you need something to attack and throttle right now, then weeds are a great substitution for that. But weeds can also be shining grace. They can be something that can get you outside doing the things you love, outside in the garden, enjoying the spring day. And you can put on an episode of the Pray to Split podcast and you can just zone. You can spend your time learning and you can spend your time pulling weeds. That's what I love to do. I love listening to garden podcasts or an audiobook when I'm pulling weeds or I'm spending time out in the garden. If it's a frustrating job, I can find the joy out of it. In fact, I wrote a whole blog post about how we can find the joy in the everyday chores that the Lord asks us to do. As mothers, as growers, as homemakers, there's chores around the home, there's chores in the garden that are frustrating. They're annoying. They are things we don't like to do, but they have to be done. A simple way to get them done is, number one, bring the Lord along with us. And number two, create a time to do something you do enjoy, connecting it. So when I have to do homemaking, like folding laundry or doing dishes, that is when I listen to my favorite podcasts. Or that is when I listen to a sermon on YouTube. Or those are the times that I get to do those special things. And it creates a change. It creates a connection of you actually start looking forward to going to pull weeds because a new podcast episode dropped and now you have something to go do while you go pull weeds. You have something to enjoy while you are doing something you don't enjoy. So your tool number 7 is your mindset. How you look at those weeds can be a good thing or they can be an annoying thing. It's your choice. And the way that mindset helps us is it helps with all types. It helps with weeds that spread by seed, by root, or severed root because it's us. We are connected. We are a tool. And yes, garden gloves protect our hands, but mindset protects us while we're doing a job that we may not enjoy doing. Tool number 9 is mulch. Now I talked about in tool number 4 of landscape fabric and newspapers, and you can use these together, but mulch is a layer of materials applied to the surface of the soil to conserve moisture, improve fertility, reduce weeds, and or to make your landscape visually appealing. Mulch can be used in combination with those newspaper and landscape fabric if that's something that you're trying to accomplish. But I think the biggest advantage we take away from mulch when we use landscape fabric underneath it is mulch is designed to feed the soil. Yes, mulch is going to need to be replaced every year, but if you think of that as you're feeding the soil, it's not going to be as troublesome because you are feeding the soil. Soil needs organic matter, and mulch is a great way to add that. Now, newspaper, you can easily put mulch above newspaper, and then all that does is lengthen the time that mulch will be there before it starts decomposing. So what kind of organic mulches can you use? Well, you can use grass clippings, as long as they are free of feed and weed herbicides. As a society, as growers, sometimes we hide the things that are bad with cute little phrases like feed and weed. Well, feed and weed is a cute little phrase, but feed and weed is feed is fertilizers, weed is herbicides. Yes, there are herbicides in that product. So if you're getting grass clippings or leaves from a neighbor, the first thing you should be asking them is, do you use feed and weed? If they do, take them if you want to, but take to the landfill because that herbicide can stay in your soil for a very long time. It can go through the composting process. You don't want to be composting it at all because it's a pesticide. Herbicide is a pesticide and it is harmful to your plants. It's harmful to your soil. It's harmful. It's not an organic process. It's not. Some other things you can be using is hay, old hay, straw, bark, sawdust, and hay is also, you're going to want to be asking who, if you're going to the store and it says weed free, well, how did they get it weed free? Okay. So be thinking about that. They're probably using an herbicide as well. So straw, bark, sawdust, wood chips, shredded newspapers, cardboard, and peat moss. All of these are great options for a mulch. And a little side note, a little side tip here is if you're using something like hay or straw or grass, make sure that grass hasn't already gone to seed before it got cut down because that seed is going to be inside that mulch and then it's going to be on your plants or wherever on the soil, and those seeds will take root, and then you will have a new weed that you're going to have to battle. So, tool number 9 is weeding schedule. Weeding is best done. I think I talked about that before as a side little tip, but weeding is best done when the weeds are young. Young weeds are small and usually don't have a strong root system. This makes it easy to control them. Implementing a weekly or daily weeding schedule in your garden plan will help you stay ahead. Weeds grow 24 hours a day, which makes our best tool steady progress. Kind of like the tortoise and the hare fable. We have to keep moving forward on those weeds. We have to keep up with them. We can't just put them on the back burner and think that they're not growing. No, they grow 24 hours a day. So we have to think about them in our garden 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And by one way that we don't have to think about them all the time is implementing a schedule. Weed seed germinates every 7 days and become hard to pull 4 days after that. So if you set a schedule of weeding every 3 days or weeding every 4 days, then you're going to catch those seeds when they germinate. Just when they barely germinate, you're going to be barely plucking them out and you're going to be able to get ahead of your weed problem. And this tool helps with all different types of spreading weeds. The ones that spread by root, by seed, by severed root, because you are getting them when they're babies. They're not having a time to take hold in your garden. They're not having time to suck nutrients from your soil. They're not taking advantage of you. So those are my 9 best tools. Now there's several other ways that you can control seeds on your homestead and in your garden, like solarization and topping and plant spacing and having fertile soil or precise watering. And I have a blog post that you can go learn more about those ways. But today I just wanted to cover those best tools. And I think the best ones that you can implement are tool number 1, weed identification. Know what plants you're looking at. Know their advantages and turn them into weaknesses. And number 2 is a weeding schedule. You're going to catch those weeds way before they get big in your garden. There's going to be days, there's going to be weeks that those weeds are going to get away from you. And use your mindset, use your mulch, use your hose, use all your garden gloves, your garden knives to eradicate them once they get away from you. But the 2 top things you can do is identify and make a weeding schedule. So I want to thank you for joining me today in this episode of the Pray Just Plant podcast. If this is your first time, I want to thank you for listening and welcome you to the Red Ridge Farm community of fellow growers. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to comment below or go to the best place that I can answer them is go to the show notes or even go to our new Facebook group called the Red Ridge Farm Group of Fellow Growers, where you can connect with me and connect with others just like you and get your questions answered. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.